my students here in the United States, to analysts here in Armenia and elsewhere. I'm really excited to have the three scholars that are listed. I do apologize, there's a typo on the agenda, but not on the electronic version. But before we get to our the round table, I would like to hear what we have with us, Mark Mamegonian, who is leading the National Association for Armenian Studies in Research in Boston, Massachusetts, and Belmont, Massachusetts, and Nasser has been a great supporter of not only covering contemporary issue areas for Armenia, covering Russia-Ukraine war, organizing panels on that topic, but also sponsoring, co-sponsoring this conference. So we're very, very thankful for Mark. So what we're trying to do is to give Mark an opportunity to address the Armenian audience here and connect to analytical centers here. And Mark, if you could say a few words about Nasser, 5 minutes or so, and then we could move to our panelists, our roundtable. Great to see you all.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Anna, thank you so much. I will be really brief. I know you've got a full agenda, but good afternoon, and I appreciate the opportunity to say just a few words about Nasser. And I want to first and foremost thank the organizers and the hosts of this important conference and the people at Eurasia International University for bringing together such an outstanding group of scholars to discuss a topic or a group of topics that could hardly be more timely and more relevant for Armenia, for the region, for the whole world. And I, of course, especially want to thank my friend, colleague, and frequent collaborator or co-conspirator, Anna Ohanyan. So organizing programs on contemporary issues relating to Armenia and Armenians has been part of Nasser's work ever since the very beginning, going back to the 1950s. But around 2014, we made a conscious effort to up our game in that regard and to make an effort to increase the quantity and quality and scope of our programs on contemporary topics. And with the support of the Gulbenkian Foundation since 2016, our ongoing series of programs on contemporary topics, with the ever valuable input and frequently the participation of Anna Ohanyan herself, who has been essential in several roles, has, I feel, made a useful contribution to helping to frame fact-based discussions of current and often controversial subjects ranging from diasporan Armenian identity, environmental issues in Armenia, women's empowerment, the ups and downs of the Velvet Revolution and its aftermath, the conflict with Azerbaijan, and a great deal more. Most of these are topics that you can read no shortage of views about in the Armenian press and in the Armenian world and online. And some of these views are very valuable and worth listening to. We try to root the programs we do, and certainly this conference is a great example in scholarship and research to allow people to form their own opinions based on reliable information. A novel concept in the world today, I suppose. Consequently, when Anna approached me about Nasser supporting this conference, of course, this was accepted with enthusiasm because the conference is so in keeping with what we've been striving to do these past years, and to have the opportunity to bring it, to have it take place in Armenia was that much more significant. So I'm really happy and proud for the Nasser Gulbenkian Foundation Contemporary Series to be able to support this conference, and I certainly welcome such collaborations continuing in the future, and I look forward, now that I'm awake, to being able to hear some of the rest of the discussions today. I appreciate your time and everybody's efforts. Thank you.
I was just thanking you, Mark, for speaking to our audience here, but also looking forward to more opportunities for you to connect with a network of institutes here at universities in establishing the networks between the community here, research community here. And thank you again for your support. And now, let me allow me to move to our panel. And let me just say a few words as to how we structured this particular panel. What we thought to do is we'll start with Professor Brian Taylor, who can focus on Russia's domestic politics and the political economy, a little bit before and after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. How has Russia been changing after the war is the very important question that many analysts, the broader public has been asking. And of course, sort of the simplistic assumption that is sort of in the back of everybody's mind is whether this is going to create, if the war drags on, whether there will be backlash against Putin. So we're looking forward to hear from Brian on this. We can then move to Alex Cooley, who can highlight in broad strokes, and I realize I'm putting too much on the plate, how Russia's posture relative to its vast political periphery has been changing, perhaps with a focus on Central Asia. And Alex also has been writing a lot on hierarchy, one of my most fascinating aspects of his research, whether or not hierarchy relations within the Eurasian continent are shifting. Is it safe to say that if a weakened Russia is emerging from the war in Ukraine, do the post-Soviet states emerge with a stronger bargaining power to a certain extent? The risks for them are also many, but is it too naive to assume that some of these post-Soviet states can have a better bargaining position relative to Russia in renegotiating their relationships? And we can then move to Professor Mark Katz, who can underline, take us to the Middle East, and focus on the effects of Russia's posture positioning in the Middle East after the war intervention, invasion in Ukraine. Any projections, whether Russia, perhaps a much weakened Russia, will continue to stay in the Middle East or not, if so, in which capacity? And I should take this as an opportunity to mention, I already mentioned this, that Professor Katz just published an article, a very important, fascinating piece on in the responsible statecraft, focused on the impact of Russia's invasion in Ukraine on Iran. Before I proceed, let me also introduce more formally our speakers. In brief, I should say that I have been reading all three scholars for more than a decade, and I have been learning so much from them, and I'll just take this as an opportunity to express my deep gratitude for their thoughtful and high caliber scholarship. With this, let me introduce Professor Brian Taylor, who is a professor of political science at Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, an institution that I love, a place from where I graduated as well. He chaired the political science department there from 2017 to 2020, and his research has been supported by Smith Richardson Foundation, the Fulbright Commission, the Carnegie Corporation, Harvard University, to name a few. His research focuses on the development of the Russian state, its state coercive organizations, military and the police. And Professor Taylor's books and articles are too many to list, but I would like to highlight the Code of Putinism, which has been a great research and a teaching resource for me, both here in Armenia as well as in the US. Next, we'll move to Alexander Cooley. Professor Cooley is the Claire Cho Professor of Political Science at Barnard College at Columbia University and an Academy Adjunct faculty member at Chatham House. From 2015 to 2021, he served as the 13th director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. His research examines how external actors, including emerging powers, international organizations, multinational companies, NGOs, and Western enablers of grand corruption, have influenced the development, governance, and sovereignty of the former Soviet states, with a focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. Professor Cooley is an author of numerous books and articles, but I will mention those that are particularly relevant to South Caucasus. Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia, with Yale University Press 2017, co-authored with John Heathershaw, More recently, Exit from Hegemony, The Unraveling of the American Global Order, that's 2020, and co-authored with Daniel Nexon. And his Logic of Hierarchy is the one that I've realized the most. I'm sharing all my trade secrets, by the way. And then Professor Mark Katz, with whom I had the pleasure of collaborating on the Russia Abroad, Driving Regional Fracture in the Post-Communist Eurasia, edited volume, where Mark Katz wrote a fascinating chapter on the Middle East. Professor Katz is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University, and he's authored The Third World and Soviet Military Thought with Johns Hopkins University Press, Russia and Arabia, Soviet Foreign Policy Toward the Arabian Peninsula, Gorbachev Military Policy in the Third World. I could go on. One of the more recent ones, Living Without Losing, The War on Terror After Iraq and Afghanistan. During 2017, Professor Katz was a visiting scholar, first at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, and at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. During 2018, he was a Fulbright Scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and the Sir William Lewis Fellow at Durham University in the UK. In February, he was appointed a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome all. I will now transition this conversation to Brian Taylor. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction and for the chance to be here to talk to all of you at the Summer Institute and for this conference. It's also great to be on a panel with friends Alex Cooley and Mark Katz. So as Professor Ohanian said, I'm going to be talking about the Russian side of the story in terms of domestic politics and domestic economic developments. But before I start on that, just something I like to say when I talk to American audiences, probably less important for this audience, but we're talking about this topic of the war in Ukraine and its broader impact, in this analytical fashion, but it's a reminder that tens of thousands of people have died. Millions of people literally have been uprooted from their homes as a result of this war, which has been going now over 4 months and shows no sign of winding down or reaching any kind of settlement anytime soon. So I'm not talking today about the military aspects. I'm happy in question and answer if people want to talk about those issues. I certainly can. I know you have other speakers for this conference talking about that more directly. So in terms of politics and economics, where is Russia 4 months after the beginning of the war? I think if I could sum it up in one sentence, they're actually, by which I mean the Russian state, is doing better than I might have expected, when the war started. But I still expect that over time, assuming the war continues as it's going now, that things will get worse, both politically and economically, for the Russian state. So in terms of domestic politics, over the last 4 months, it's become considerably more repressive, which is really actually saying something after what's happened over the last 22 years, and especially over the last 2 years. It's worth just reminding that, in the year before the war, we had the assassination attempt on Alexei Navalny, the rounding up of many of his associates, the banning of his organization. The rest of his team was forced to flee abroad. We had a wide expansion of the use of designations of political actors and others as undesirable or as foreign agents and other sorts of labels, increase in arrests and that kind of thing. And since the war started, all of those trends have gotten considerably worse. The media narratives have become quite extreme, I would say, if one watches Russian television, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend one do on a regular basis, but if one does, some of the narratives about the war and about Russia and about the domestic opponents of the war have really ratcheted up. Increase in social monitoring, increase arrests. We had a sentence announced just today, of a Moscow sort of city deputy who was sentenced to 7 years for calling the war a war. Right, you're only supposed to refer to it as a special military operation in Russia. Just last week, one of Russia's most respected economists was detained and may face trial at some point. We don't know how that's going to develop. And even the most modest kind of expressions of opposition to the war can lead to punishment. So if I were to go out on the streets in Moscow, not me as a foreigner, but a Russian, and held up a sign like this, right, nothing written on it, one could still be detained for expressing opposition publicly to the war. Now, having said all that, I think one thing that's interesting about how the Russian state has responded to the war, we see some kind of efforts to, mobilize support based on TV narratives and, factories demonstrating their support for the war and that kind of thing. But I think in general, the Putin regime is still more interested in demobilizing society than mobilizing society. I think they would prefer that many people treat the war as something that's happening in the background, not think of it as a war, think of it as something that's happening over there and that'll be wrapped up soon. So we're not seeing this kind of effort to mobilize society actively. It's more an attempt to repress those who oppose and have the rest of the population tune things out. So if we think of this just a bit more conceptually, authoritarian regimes face two basic kinds of threats, one from the elites, so we can shorthand think of this as a coup, and then one from the masses or the streets. So we've got the elites on one hand and the streets on the other, and the threat from the masses is a potential uprising or revolutionary situation. I would say before this war started, there was no threat to Putin from either of those sources, either from the elites or from the masses. And currently, there doesn't seem to be much threat from either of those sources as well, although I think the risk of the war, which I think has to be categorized as a big mistake for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about. But I think, the potential for the threats from elites in the streets to increase is certainly there over time, depending on how things develop. At the moment, however, the elites are really dependent on Putin and dependent on the state and divided. And we've seen a few minor kind of defections of, prominent people who have left Russia or have spoken out against the war, but it's really actually very minor. And the figures who sort of left and parted company are the economic elites who, they were more kind of marginal figures at this point. So no one central to the regime has left. There were reports and rumors that the head of the central bank tried to resign and Putin said she couldn't. We know from a recent report that the deputy head of the central bank, who is an American trained economist, got her PhD at MIT, considered very liberal, has been telling her colleagues in the West that, well, if she doesn't stay, then they'll bring in people much more conservative than her. So it's her responsibility to stay. And those people who might be considered in the Russian context liberals have convinced themselves that they have to stay and do what they can. But I think we also see that other sections of the elite, including those that in Russian they call the Sloviki, people from the security services and the military, are still, quite united around Putin as well. And I would also say divided against each other, right? There's no chance for one of these organizations or members of one of these organizations, even if they did oppose the war, to try and organize anything for reasons I can go into if people are interested. In terms of the elite or the masses, there's seems to be, from what we can tell, general support, a hardcore group that opposes about maybe 20-25% of the war, especially younger people. But most people are demobilized, disinterested. Some people have been repressed. And many people, I would say, have been convinced, by the propaganda they hear from state media that Russia had no choice, that it was under threat, and so on. The urban middle class in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg have not really been affected by this. Most of the fighting is being done by soldiers from the ethnic minority regions, like Tuva or Buryatia or the North Caucasus, or from poor parts of Russia. And the state has been trying to resist any kind of general mobilization because of the fear of generating backlash. Okay, a few words about the economy. So before the war, for the period from 2014 to 2021, the economy had grown on average at less than 1% a year, which is far below what the state had set as its goals. And Russia has been falling further and further behind the advanced industrial democracies that it was trying to catch up with, in that they achieved some success in the early Putin years, but it's been a long time really since major growth has been an issue in Russian politics. They've faced a decline in living standards of around 10% over the last 8 years, and that's going to get worse this year. And I think most importantly, there's no coherent state plan to break out of the current stagnation that the economy is in. Of course, because of the war, things are getting worse. So in the short term, the central bank has stabilized the financial system. Russia has plenty of money, despite the blocking sanctions against some of their assets. And they have plenty of money because of gas and oil and coal and their other energy resources. And so that continues to fund the war. So they don't have any sort of shortage of funds to pay for the war. On the other hand, pensions are dropping in real terms. Salaries are dropping in real terms because of inflation. And they've had to introduce some special economic measures to sort of force industrial production to support the war, forced overtime and that kind of thing. They've just adopted these measures in the last week. So I think the problem for the economy is not so much financial, it's more on the production side. They've seen a huge drop in imports because of the sanctions. And that disrupts supply chains for production. It disrupts logistics. And in the medium term, like by the fall, some people think that this could cause problems in terms of ability to pay salaries, perhaps an increase in unemployment, or people working without getting paid for months at a time, and that kind of thing. So let me just give you a couple of examples in terms of production numbers. If you compare May 2022 to May 2021, production of passenger cars is down 97%. That was not a mistake, 97%. So domestic auto production has basically stopped because of supply chain issues. Production of TVs down 50% year on year, fridges 58%, washing machines 59%, trucks 39%, railway freight cars 52%. In the one piece of good news, production of cigarettes is down 25%. So maybe that'll have long-term health benefits. I don't know. But these are what the head of the Bank of Finland's Institute for Studying Transition Economies called mind-staggering numbers. The whole industrial base of the country is teetering. So I think the big sort of question mark is whether these production difficulties that haven't hit so hard in all sectors, but hit very hard in some sectors, spread throughout the economy because of the sanctions. And it remains to be seen if Russia can reorient more of its supply chains to countries that are not part of the sanctions effort. And I guess the last thing I want to say about the economy is, as long as Putin is president, regardless of whether the war ends, I think economic development is out of the question. I don't think we'll see a return to major growth. We'll probably see 8 to 10% economic decline this year. And the question is really not so much will they develop and grow, but will they avoid catastrophe? And at the moment, it looks like the economy will become more primitive, lower productivity, and the state will be forced to take a bigger and bigger role. And all of this is absent the more medium-term need, by which I mean over the next 10 years, to transition away from the resource addiction that's at the heart of the Russian economy as the leading industrial powers try and reduce carbon emissions because of climate change. So in terms of the war, I don't think we can see any major economic or political problems over the next year that would force them to stop fighting the war. But I also think that the prognosis going forward for Russia is quite bleak because of the war and because of the sanctions and because of a political regime that has basically checked out on the idea of future development for Russia. So I will stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much, Ryan. You put so much on the table. One quick question as we go down the road for the Q&A. To what extent can China offset this dramatic decline in productive capacity, if at all? We know that China has been benefiting in lower natural resources that Russia has in terms of buying, and many Russian analysts who did they seem to be pretty hopeful that China somehow is going to help them create this alternative order that they're talking about, which doesn't seem realistic if you don't know a little bit about China. So I'll stop here and maybe we'll return to that question. Thank you so very much. I'll move to Alex. Alex, the floor is yours. The screen is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anna. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here with you and fellow panelists, Brian and Mark, and thank you to the sponsors for bringing us together too. So I think the task is ambitious, but you know, I think it's also necessary because we tend to, at least I tend to get stuck in certain patterns of seeing the region and, you know, the world and the fallout. And so, you know, in some ways, I think what's happening in Ukraine is challenging a bit some of our assumptions we've had about the region over the last couple of decades, or some of the analytical frames that we put on there. So I'll get into some of those details. I just want to just open though by pointing to a couple of themes before I discuss the impact in Eurasia and post-Soviet Eurasia. One is that of Western unity, right? So the war really brought about a unified Western response that surprised everyone, Vladimir Putin included, I think Western leaders included. The origins of the unified response are numerous. They have to do with the way that American intelligence, I think, leaked what was about to happen, and sequential deals that were done behind the scenes that if we're right, and if this happens, then we'll agree to take this and this and this measure. So a careful pre-planning that was also conditioned by some other incidents in 2021 that weren't well planned, like Afghanistan withdrawal, the Australian French nuclear submarine fiasco. But you saw this unity and very well crafted sequence of response, right? First and foremost, coordinated central bank sanctions, right? This wasn't just an American response, it wasn't just a European response. This was the Western cartel, right? Basically a unified response blocking your ability to transact in these currencies. I think Medvedev rightly referred to this as a form of economic warfare. It wasn't something that was being discussed too much beforehand, and you know, the emphasis was more on SWIFT and whether that would be the big option. But so a whole menu of coordinated sanctions, blocking sanctions, and central bank sanctions. We also saw agreements to expand NATO, right, which is being ratified now. We saw individual countries supply weapons of increasing sophistication and worth to Ukraine. We saw a almost unified private sector response, decoupling from the Russian market, right? Making these decisions within 48 hours. Many of them, which had been in Russia, had endured every kind of political risk that there is. Companies like BP, ExxonMobil, as well as big retailers like IKEA. Just basically after being on emergency calls with their board saying there's no way we can manage reputationally what's happening here, as well as the supply chain concerns that Brian mentioned, but also fears of shareholder activism, right? There was, I think, just such widespread revulsion in the West of what's happening here. And then finally, I think the maximalist campaign, right? The nature that immediately Kiev was going to be under attack, that we might have a government in exile within 48 hours. This added to the sense of urgency. I think these measures were enacted. And even topics that you might have thought, or phenomena that you might have thought would have divided the West, like large-scale refugee flows, ended up being a unified factor. So this Western unity, I think now has increasingly being contrasted with non-Western or global South indifference, in some cases apathy. Yes, the UN vote, we only had 35 abstentions and a few negative votes as opposed to 65 abstentions in 2014 in a similar vote on Crimea's territorial integrity. But the fact is those abstentions are comprised by about half of humanity. And there are different reasons why different countries don't back Ukraine overtly. Some are self-interested, some are economic. China and India, for instance. India very much has a history of cooperation, sort of defense industry ties with India, but also with Russia, but also this desire to be part of a multipolar world. In other parts of the world, the memes of US hypocrisy, colonialism, anti-imperialism. Now you might think it's sort of strange, given this kind of a colonial action against Ukraine, that there might be the response. But in any case, it's clear also that the Russian disinformation campaign has been actually quite effective in the global South. So we have Western unity on the one hand. We have, I think, an increasing fraying or indifference in the global South. Some arms are being squeezed and have been on these votes, but in general, it hasn't been the kind of strong support for Ukraine perhaps some would have hoped for. So then what's going on in the post-Soviet space itself, for lack of a better word? I think what we're seeing is a set of almost unimaginable pressures on these governments that are increasingly difficult to reconcile. And let me identify sort of three of them, right? First is this business of having to pick sides officially in the war. On the one hand, condemn the war or support Russia. And predictably, almost every Eurasian government is trying to avoid either. Yeah. And so what you're seeing in UN security, in UN General Assembly votes are abstentions or just not voting. Countries just like refusing to vote. They're just out in lunch in Midtown in New York, right? Not wanting to go on the record. Very similar actually to what happened in Crimea, certainly in the Central Asian cases, or backing Russia in the case of Belarus. So I think there's this trying to navigate not wanting to condemn Russia publicly, but not wanting to support Ukraine either. The way this has been parsed in some countries, and you saw this with Tokayev in Kazakhstan, the St. Petersburg Forum, is to say we will never recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent entities, right? But that's not a condemnation of Russia. That's just saying we're not going to recognize these entities like we're not going to recognize Abkhazia or South Ossetia, right? And so, but then even that has started to get him in trouble when he was pushed by Simonian. And now we've seen the spat that I'll get into a little bit later. So picking sides, extremely difficult. All of Eurasian governments are trying to avoid doing so in public, and Moscow is increasingly focused on these votes. Second, sanctions. Right? So the problem with the Western response is that the sanctions regime is incredibly disruptive to Eurasian economies. And this is sort of across the board. And even countries that you would expect that are publicly, have condemned the war are sticking to their guns and not enacting the kind of comprehensive sanctions that the West and Ukraine would like them to. And I'm thinking about the Georgian case here, right? And so, Georgia's wine market, half of wine exports go to Russia, very heavily reliant on Russian tourism. Visa-free travel with Russia also facilitates economic exchange. And then you've seen a real spat between the president's office and the prime minister's office on the question of sanctions. Now, of course, Georgia is part of the financial system globally, and so those are enacted. But in terms of Georgia's own sanctions, it's not happening. And in fact, it's getting, quite tricky, but also I think, there's a sense of also lingering resentment from 2008. Sort of where was the massive sanctions regime when our territory was occupied, when we had these recognitions of independence and de facto annexations of these breakaway territories and so forth. But then you also have these really fascinating cases of sanctions avoidance, right? And you've seen now the beginnings of the US Treasury sanctioning entities. I don't know whether, these were such egregious violations that they had to be done, or that they're just picking targets strategically to be able to signal, like, we're watching you, right? So there was prominent sanctioning of an Uzbek entity just a few days ago for its dealings with a Russian financial, and this has also scuttled a privatization deal. On the other hand, the question of reflagging Russian operations is a very live one. First and foremost in the Eurasian Economic Union, right? Where a lot of these companies can relocate and re-register, but also a country like Turkey. It's part of NATO. Has openly said, we are not going to be involved in participating in economic sanctions. In fact, Turkish finance ministers say, we're open to oligarch money. And this is nothing to say of the Gulf, right? In the UAE, that has become now a haven for taking in sanctioned individuals and their money as well. So there's all sorts of different roles that are being played in the sanctions regime, but these countries are desperate for sanctions relief, right? And it puts them in an extremely tight spot. I had a conversation the first 10 days of the war with a Central Asian ambassador who said, we're a landlocked country. We can't export through Iran. You won't give us a waiver the way you do India to export through Iran. We can't do business with these companies in Xinjiang, in which we have borders. Now we have Russian sanctions. What do you want us to do, right? How is it that we're supposed to get our goods out to market? And of course, in the case of Kazakhstan, this was underscored today, or rather yesterday, with the announcement that the pipeline, the Katz pipeline consortium, was going to be blocked for a month by Russia for so-called regulatory environmental infractions, when in fact it's clear that this is a response to Tokayev's criticism of the war, or implied criticism of the war. So my point is economic vulnerability here, yeah? Really across the board. And in some ways, the West is offering a lot of a program. It's offering solidarity with Ukraine and support of Ukraine, but the Eurasian states itself, it's not offering a whole lot more right now. And I think we need to be honest about it, right? What is the West offering in these sort of circumstances beyond economic pain and compliance concerns? The third point, and this is something I think that is probably very noticeable in Yerevan, the new Russian exodus, right? The exodus of exiles, I think, is reorienting some very specific functions and flows and sources of influence on the Eurasian map. There's some of the data from some of the surveys now of these new emigre exile communities, if you want to use either word. So in Georgia, 2021, we had in April about 8,000 migrants from Russia. In 2022, 134,000, or rather 38,000. In Armenia, it was 44,000 in 2021, 134,000 in 2022. So we are seeing these numbers that I'm sure you've noticed on the streets of Yerevan of tens of thousands, mostly IT workers, right? Who, as the IT industry has withdrawn, as it's been shut down, have moved across to various venues. Yerevan, Tbilisi, Istanbul, Tashkent even, in an attempt to find work and so forth. So what does this create? Well, first of all, the thing that enabled this was that these workers went to places that had visa-free travel, right? So Georgia, Armenia, right? Also the payment systems under sanctions, the fact that you can use Mir in Armenia. This infrastructure that was set up for Russian influence has actually facilitated a regional flight and this kind of in-between status. Now, again, according to these surveys, about 85 to 90% of those surveyed indicate that they want to go back at some point and they have family at some point. But the status is very much in flux. Give you another important example here, media. As all final remnants of independent media have been shut down, they have gone into exile, and now we're seeing actually Riga become the hub, right? Some journalists were going to Tbilisi, I'm going to Yerevan, but now we're aggregating around Riga. This is not only the center of Medusa, and has been since 2014, but many Western bureaus that had Moscow bureaus are now relocating into Riga itself. So we're going to see Riga become the source of sort of the Russian media exile community, just like Vilnius is the center of the activist community. So that map is being redrawn. And then the final dimension of this that I think I need to consider is all, these population flows of new Russians are actually attracting the attention, of course, of Russian security services. Yeah. And so we're seeing increased evidence of joint monitoring, surveillance, sometimes even travel denials. And these pressures are just going to grow on keeping tabs on political dissidents and opponents that are in these post-Soviet states. So just where do I want to go with this sort of analytically? And I mentioned the sort of shaking up assumptions. Certainly, I think in Western analytical communities, but also in Russians, I think for about 15, 20 years, there was this tendency to see the kind of post-Soviet states in a kind of a billiard ball tug of war, right, between the West and Western sponsored architectures. The Eastern Partnership with the EU was viewed as the geoeconomic cause of 2014 and Maidan and the protests, or Georgia's desire to join NATO in 2008 and chart a European path led to initiate the Russian response in August, and also Medvedev's famous spheres of influence speech, right? And so we're accustomed to thinking about the in-between countries, the borderland countries, tugging to and fro, and then sort of charting a kind of geopolitical competition. I actually think this kind of view was becoming dated anyway, if ever it had an appeal. I think you've seen a lot of informal cooperation between, say, Russia and Turkey in the last 2 years, certainly in the Caucasus, certainly in the fallout and the conduct of the Second Karabakh War, just like you see a lot of informal cooperation, formal cooperation between Russia and China and Central Asia. And again, certainly in the wake of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. But what I think you're seeing now is these competing geopolitical pressures within these states, right? And these new networks of associations that pit not only ministries against ministries, but also possibly municipalities versus sort of central governments, right? So municipalities that are hosting exiled tech workers like what they see and want to bet the economic benefits from this, whereas there's real concerns about possible political disruptions and sort of hiding persons of interest. And so I think, thinking about the new kinds of networks that are being constituted across the region in response to these pressures and dealing with these pressures of picking sides, sanctions, Russian exiles, to me, these are the elements that are going to determine the constitutive geopolitics going forward. But again, I'm going to emphasize, this is an extraordinarily tough spot for all the governments. This is something they obviously didn't want to deal with. And the scope of the pressure that they're facing, I think we can't downplay. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. Indeed, in downtown Yerevan, the presence of Russians is very, very noticeable. Downtown Yerevan sometimes feels like New York City in terms of the density of the people on the sidewalk, which is very odd for Yerevan. But also, you put so much on the table. One question that I have is, what does this mean in terms of the Western exit from hegemony, or American exit from hegemony? Is there something about the United States has put so much of the sanction regimes, that it can create backlash, etc., that it's not offering anything to all of the states that have to, the ones that are on the fence, that have to do the balancing, that are really economically are limited. Perhaps in the Q&A, I would love to hear your thoughts as to what would have been a better policy for the United States moving forward, considering the limitations of this level of economic containment applied to Russia, this level of sanctions regime applied on Russia, which is going to have ripple effects. Thanks so much, Alex. Thank you. Let's move to Professor Mark Katz. Mark, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you so very much. And I want to join my colleagues in thanking Anna Ohanyan for the invitation to to speak to you. It's been a great pleasure working with Anna, having my chapter in her very interesting volume on regional fracture come out by Georgetown University Press. I see she has a new book that's come out with Stanford University Press. Really, she is just an amazing force in terms of academically, and it's just been a great pleasure to work with you. It's also great to be here with Brian and Alex. And I'm going to focus today on the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the Middle East. And just to start off, there's been three main impacts that we've seen so far. The first has to do with food security, that the Middle East were mainly importing grain and other agricultural products from the Black Sea region, from both Ukraine and from Russia. Obviously, Ukraine's exports have been greatly limited by Russian action. The Russians seem to be selling less of it because they want to keep more at home. There's also cost issues in terms of shipping. And this is having a very significant impact throughout the Middle East, especially in poorer countries. And I believe, as we know, the 2011 Arab uprisings were preceded by food price hikes in several countries. And so the risk of something like this happening again is real. The second impact, on the other hand, is that certain Middle Eastern countries, oil exporting countries, have really benefited. Obviously, the price of oil has risen with the US-led effort to sanction Russian oil exports in particular, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, that they are sitting pretty in terms of the oil price having risen. They're doing fairly well, as are other oil exporting countries. And then thirdly, and I think what was perhaps surprising to some in Washington was that unlike obviously the European countries which have rallied around to support Ukraine, this is not true in the Middle East. Now, it's not surprising that America's adversaries in the Middle East are not supportive of Ukraine. But what I think is interesting is that each and every American ally in the Middle East has good relations with Russia, which it is not prepared to harm, that we've seen. In other words, every single one. Now, during the Cold War, what we saw was that there was this Soviet American competition. The US had its allies, the Soviets had its own allies. There were very few countries that had good relations with both. There were a couple. That there was sometimes switching between alliances, but that essentially it was sort of a zero-sum region. Since Putin has come into power at the turn of the century, he has worked assiduously to improve Russia's relations with every American ally in the Middle East, while of course keeping good relations with traditional Russian ones. And it's really paid off with regard to this war with Ukraine, that we have not seen Middle Eastern countries join in American-led sanctions. We have seen, or to condemn Russia, and there's been a lot of trade going on, as my colleagues indicated, and there are several reasons for this. Certainly several of America's allies who are principally concerned about Iran, they basically aren't as concerned about Russia, and they know that Russia and Iran work together, and a lot of America's allies who are concerned about Iran, they want to keep Russia on side. And we've seen this with Israel, we've seen this with Saudi Arabia, with the United Arab Emirates in particular, that they sort of bought the Russian argument that the best way for them to keep Iran under wraps is to work with Russia, and so that that the Russians can help can help moderate Iranian behavior. Whether this is actually true is another matter, but that what's interesting is that America's Middle Eastern allies have essentially accepted this logic, that they'd rather work with Russia than fear that if they don't, Russia can do all the more to help the Iranians. There's also been a desire to link giving Washington what it wants in return for Washington giving more of what they want. They want less criticism over human rights issues, over their democratic deficits, and they want increased support with regard to Iran. There's that they as far as they're concerned, just like as the Georgians are not happy that the West didn't support them as much as it's been supporting Ukraine. Certainly, the Saudis, the Emiratis, they see the America and the West as not being as supportive of their position in Yemen. Now, of course, it's not clear to me that the West should support their position in Yemen, but they see this as far more important for their security interests. And so, essentially, I think what they're looking for, and there have been these missile attacks on Saudi and Emirati territory, and they feel that the U.S. has not done enough. And so, if the U.S. wants them to do more with regard to Ukraine, they need to see the U.S. doing more for them with regard to Iran. And also, I think that what annoys many of America's Middle Eastern partners is the belief that the Ukraine conflict is simply one more example of the U.S. prioritizing other regions over the Middle East. And so the Middle East can't rely on the U.S. as much. In other words, that they have seen the pivot to Asia as taking American attention away from the Middle East. Although to me, this doesn't make sense. During the Cold War, when we were at odds with the Soviet Union, we were at odds with the Soviet Union everywhere, including the Middle East. If in fact the geopolitical competition of the future is going to be between the US and China, it will also be a competition everywhere, including the Middle East. But in any event, that's not how it's seen there. And the fact that the US is so concerned about Ukraine, with Russia, is just one more example of the US being, in their view, less interested in the Middle East. And if the US is less interested, that's just simply all the more reason for them to work with a Russia that's willing to work with them. And I think also another reason for their attitude for the Ukraine war is the possible expectation that Russia will eventually prevail in Ukraine. And so there is no benefit from annoying Moscow to joining the Western sanctions effort against it. I think this was their attitude at the very beginning of the war. I think that many people expected that it was going to be over and done very quickly. So what was the point of working against Russia? And then I think that now I think as well, especially with the territorial gains we've seen that Russia has been making, but I think there is a sense that Russia will probably do better, and therefore there's simply no reason to antagonize the Russians. And finally, I think, well, not finally, there have been oil production differences the U.S. has had with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in particular. These two are the swing producers within OPEC. In other words, they're the ones who have the greatest capacity to increase oil output. Whether it's, in fact, so many other OPEC members, they can't even achieve their quota at the moment. So if the Biden administration's hopes that to temper gasoline prices in the U.S. After the rise in the oil price partly as a result of sanctions against Russian oil depends on increased Saudi and Emirati production, and they're not doing it for that part. And they cite the need to protect the OPEC Plus agreement with Russia on production levels. There was just 2 years ago there was this Saudi-Russian oil war in which essentially Russia was producing more than the quota, and the Saudis punished the Russians by producing so much more and driving the price down until the Russians cried uncle. now essentially Saudis and the Emiratis see the Biden administration asking them to do the same thing. In other words, if their agreement depended on with Russia in the past depended on limits to oil production, they don't want to be the ones seen to be breaking it, and they don't need to, since they're sitting pretty in terms of how much money they're earning anyway. So there is that. Now, there have been other exceptions. I think what's interesting is to look at the role of Turkey, and this has been mixed. On the one hand, unlike so many Middle Eastern countries, I think Turkey is concerned about the war in Ukraine. Certainly in the past, memories of the Crimean War, the better that Russia does on the northern shore of the Black Sea, the worse this is for Turkey. At least this is how it's been in the past. And Turkey has played, a very mixed role. On the one hand, they have provided Ukraine with drones, which have reportedly been quite effective. On the other hand, Turkey has not joined with Western sanctions against Russia. Turkey also seems to be seeing Russia's distraction in Ukraine as an opportunity to perhaps act more aggressively in certain theaters where Russia and Turkey have been at odds. I think we're seeing this in Syria. I should not be surprised if we see this with regard to the Nagorno-Karabakh region as well, though I think the audience knows far more about that than I do. But essentially, I think Turkey is following a very self-interested approach. We've all seen that. Again, this mixed role. On the one hand, there have been some Turkish limits on Russian naval transits via the Turkish Straits. In other words, they don't want Russian naval vessels that are not home ported in the Black Sea to be able to come in. There's been some discussion between Russia and Turkey on a corridor for Ukrainian grain exports. It hasn't worked so far. On the other hand, we've also seen how Turkey has moved to be obstructive with regard to Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO. And although they have recently agreed to allow the process to go forward, pending certain agreements, the Turks have made clear that Turkish parliamentary approval of their membership eventually is not a done deal. And I don't think we've heard the end of this as well. So we've seen this reaction as well. Anna referred to the little piece I had just yesterday with regard to the impact of the war on Iran. Obviously Iran is a Russian partner, and sort of outwardly their relations are very good. We saw the Russian foreign minister in Tehran just recently, and we saw the meeting between Putin and the Iranian President Raisi in Turkmenistan. They were there for the Caspian summit, and all talking about how they're getting along. I think the Iranian president even far more effusive than Vladimir Putin was. On the other hand, the Russians have done lots of things that have really hurt the Iranians. Obviously the food crisis, the food price crisis isn't. It doesn't favor pro-Western or it doesn't favor anti-Western over pro-Western states. And Iran has been facing obviously hikes in food prices as well. And we have seen unrest this spring. This is something that the Iranian government is not happy with, and that the Russians don't seem to be able to do anything to alleviate. So I think from the Iranian point of view, that Russia's war in Ukraine has caused them a problem, and Russia can't really help with this particular problem. But worse than that, although many people expected that the sanctioning of Russian oil exports would lead to a boon for Iran, with world prices rising, that there would be a need for Iranian oil, and that the U.S. in particular, hey, if the Saudis and the Emiratis won't increase their oil production, but the Iranians are willing to sell that the US. And there was some discussion that the Biden administration was considering this, but of course, not only has this not happened, but that the Russians have aggressively underpriced their oil to certain markets. In other words, the Iranians were selling a lot of oil at a discount to China and India. China and India have been now turning more to Russia because the discount, something on the order of 50% over world market prices, has been much greater from Russian oil. And so just recently, there's been a report that the Iranians have further reduced the price of their oil as well. But this is obviously not a friendly move. In other words, Russia is acting in a very self-interested way, not acting to benefit its Iranian partners at all. And there are other spheres also. Apparently in the cement market, in other words, that Iran manages to export a fair amount of cement, or had been, but now the Russians are underselling the Iranians in this market as well. So they're causing tremendous difficulty. Now there have been reports, varying reports about the impact of the war in Ukraine on Syria. There have been some indications that, the Russians are moving troops and weaponry out of Syria. I think the King of Jordan in particular was very enthusiastic about this. There have been Israeli reports to the extent that no, they really haven't seen this, although there apparently are some areas in which they are handing over responsibility more to the Iranians. Now, people have talked about, certainly I've talked about how Russia and Iran are somewhat competitive in Syria. In other words, they don't want to exclude the other, but they each seem to want the upper hand in Damascus, and that such a move might actually benefit the Iranians. But I have the sense that this might not be the case. In other words, that the Russians and the Iranians, as well as Hezbollah, work fairly closely together, and that to the extent that Russia draws down at all, this simply increases the burden upon the Iranians. I also think that there's a real question about the future of the Russian-Israeli deconfliction agreement. That essentially the Russians turn a blind eye to Israeli attacks on Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria, and provided that the Israelis clear this with Russian military authorities, and it's worked out pretty well. Obviously, the Iranians are not happy that the Russians are doing this. I think Israelis have made clear that to the extent that there's a smaller Russian presence in Iran, well, then there's no need to adhere so closely to deconfliction. In other words, that if in fact there's a lesser Russian presence in Syria, I think we're going to see a increased conflict between Israel on the one hand, Iran and Hezbollah on the other. And I think that we're not going to see a diminution of American support to Israel. I think that this is not going to be so easy for the Iranians. So I think sort of the bottom line, I think, is that the war in Ukraine is causing a lot of instability in the Middle East, and that it's causing problems for the Middle East, which Russia really can't help them with. I think that if you look at Russian diplomacy under Putin toward the Middle East, it's been fairly masterful up till now. In other words, he has managed to have good relations with opposing sides simultaneously. And there's a lot of opposing sides in the Middle East. There's lots and lots of conflicts, and the Russians have basically been able to work with both sides, not out of friendship, but essentially, in other words, sort of the deal they offer is, you don't like how much we're helping your adversary? Well, we'll help you too. In other words, that they're basically willing to work with everyone, but not sacrifice anything in their relations with anyone. And they've played this game fairly well, but the problem is that if they're not able to be as supportive, in other words, or if problems arise that Russia can't deal with, either because it lacks resources or it's not focused on this or whatever, I think, there's going to be increased problems. Unlike the Soviet Union, which benefited from revolution, which benefited from instability in the Middle East and elsewhere, Vladimir Putin is like Tsarist Russia, an ultra status quo nation. In other words, it works mainly with governments or sort of established groups like Hezbollah, and it doesn't really have ties with the opposition. Now, I'm not saying the West does either, but that, in other words, if there's instability, Russian partners are going to be weakened. Now, that doesn't mean that that the West is going to necessarily be in a better position, but we do have more resources that we might be able to direct to the problem. And certainly, I think the real key is for the Saudis and the Emiratis, they're going to have to use some of those vast resources, I think, to subsidize food prices in their less wealthy neighbors if they themselves are want to keep their neighborhood calm. But it's a problem that Russia has brought about, but that Russia cannot solve. But this sort of gives, I think, for the Middle East, it gives them a perverse incentive about the war in Ukraine. They would just like to see it ended as soon as possible, even if that means a Russian victory is the way to end it. In other words, that what hurts them is the continuation of the war, not a Russian victory. And that, I think, is one of the problems that we face. And so I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has sort of we have a better sense as to sort of who our friends are and who they're not in this world. And I think that it's certainly been very revealing about the Middle East. And I just to point out, in other words, that in terms of oil-producing Middle Eastern states who are competing with Russia, if they're not willing to compete with Russia or to take advantage of this by exporting more oil to please the West, just think what it'll be like if there is a Chinese-American confrontation with China, one of their main buyers of Middle Eastern oil, that they're not going to have any incentive to stop their oil sales to China. So I think that what's happening now with Russia in the Middle East is a foreboding as to what could happen in the future if there's in fact a greater Chinese-American confrontation. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very, very much, Mark. Thank you very much. Let me go straight to the questions, if any. And Parsa has a question. Yeah, Parsa, why don't you come to the microphone?
Hello everyone, hello to all our panelists, respected panelists from abroad. So actually, for me, I would just make my question to addressing to Iran and Russia, because they are the main players in South Caucasus, in my opinion, or at least the main players, or two of the main players. So the thing is, when we come to sanctions, when we consider sanctions as a way of limiting and slowing down the some of the regimes that they are out of control sometimes, and trying to settle down a little bit the situation with them, or just supplying their enemies. I'm not sure if both of them could work really good for the past couple of decades, because if sanctions could really work, they could really do something about Iran's regime, which for past 40 more than 40 years, or let's say more than 4 decades, they are continuing the way they taken 40 years ago, and nothing changes about them, because they got even more powerful, they got more even more authority in the region, and they are now one of the main players in the Middle East. So sanctions, my question to Professor Cooley and Professor Katz are like, what would you think about like reconsidering about sanctions as a tool to control regimes that they are out of control actually, like Iran's regime, for instance, or supplying their enemies. That's even a worse thing could happen, in my opinion. As an Iranian citizen, I would say that it's just like it works actually opposite, because these regimes, they get even more powerful. Through what I have experienced by living in Iran, I can see that sanctions, supplying their enemies, or getting more closer to their enemies, it makes them more even stronger. Iran never got out of the international market, though that the aim of sanctions was like to get them out of the market. But still, they have the very good, strong hand in international trade and market. So we're supposed to have them not very powerful as they are now, but they are still like 13th power in the military ranking in the planet, in the world. So these are the things that are always my concern. Like, until when exactly do we want to continue some tools like sanctioning, like supplying their enemies? Because they continue. What do you think would be the best solution with dealing with regimes like Iran's regime, China's regime, Russia's regime? Because I'm not saying they are good or bad, or other like countries are good or bad. I'm saying like these regimes are getting out of control day by day and day after another, and I'm not seeing any prosperity for us. In like 10 years, what would we do with these regimes? Because they get even stronger and they get even an upper hand towards all of us. And countries like Armenia, we will suffer more than the others, because we are the buffer zone. We are the states that they are not really being considered as states for those of regimes, and they just see us as like tools to play around in the regions. So we suffer more than the others. What would be this best idea to get rid of such powers, like fastest possible, like as soon as possible? That is my question.
Thank you very much, Marcy. So I guess the question is alternative to sanctions. And we've heard from Alex that there is backlash, there are like kind of structural risks for the West, and Mark also is touching on those things. So perhaps either both of you or one of you could take it up.
Yeah, I'll just comment on sanctions in general. I'll let Mark and his expertise comment on Iran, before and now. Look, I think the question in general with sanctions is, you impose sanctions as an alternative to what? As an alternative to becoming involved militarily, right? So sanctions are less than ideal, but they're imposed both to signal opprobrium and to signal that there need to be costs for gross violations of international law or international norms. Now, of course, these are selectively applied. They're applied by the strong. They're applied inconsistently, but that's the general premise around sanctions. And as the international financial system has become more sophisticated and more dependent on financial transactions and clearinghouse transactions, the financial sanctions have become more and more appealing, right? Because they're a way that, the US can use its particular nodes and its particular control of that infrastructure to try and target those regimes. Now, of course, sanctioning an economy of hundreds of billions of dollars is different than trillions of dollars, right? And that's the difference between Iran and Russia. Now, the Biden administration would tell you that the general purpose of the sanctions is to, over the medium and long term, degrade Russia's military capability so that it can't continue its war of aggression. And so some of the things like sensitive technologies, Russian defense industries, these export controls, all of these have that in mind. But it's not just one thing. The final aspect of this, well, no, a couple more points. Sanctions to be effective, and someone like Richard Nephew right, who was coordinating sanctions for a long time. Now he's head of global anti-corruption. He was my colleague here at the Energy Center, would say sanctions always have to be tied to a political outcome, right? And that's what we don't have right now, right? The Russians have indicated that they want sanctions relief to be part of whatever deal is happening, but we don't have a political process to put sanctions on the table. And so sanctions now are really statements of opprobrium and statements, there's also a kind of individual logic that if you target individuals who are close to the Kremlin, they'll put pressure for the Kremlin to change course. That's also some logic behind sanctioning the oligarchs. I don't think that's going to be effective. I'd be interested in Brian's view on that. Maybe 10 years ago would have been a different story. So sanctions serve a lot of different goals, but absent a political process that their removal can be tapped into, they do have the tendency to avalanche, and they avalanche because there are no alternative tools as far as policymakers go, short of becoming involved militarily. And the Biden administration has done really almost gone out of its way to signal what red lines are to avoid sort of escalation of the conflict into a NATO-Russian clash.
Thank you very much, Alex. Mark, do you want to add anything to it, perhaps from the Iran angle?
Right. I'll just add briefly. I think I agree with everything that Alex says. I think that Americans, whether liberal or conservative, they love sanctions. They both enjoy putting them on various adversaries. It's something that we do when we don't want to use force. But the problem with it is that they're easy to put on for us. They don't really work. And so what we simply do is to increase them. And they still don't work, but it feels good, basically. And I think the real problem is that we have now, we've imposed sanctions on too many different countries. In other words, if we just sanction one or two countries, we might be able to help kind of block those countries' trade with the rest of the world. But if we try to impose sanctions on a lot of countries, then we simply give them an incentive to trade with each other. And I think, obviously China, it's a mixed picture, but obviously Russia and Iran can both export to China. And so this I think changes things. I think also that our sanctions policy applying to so many countries, we're not prioritizing what our main opponents are. I think personally that sort of a realpolitik approach, if we've identified that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a more serious threat, then I think we have to, I would argue that one way to respond is to drop sanctions against Iran, even if there is no Iranian nuclear agreement, not out of any expectation that Iran is going to have better relations with us, but simply out of the calculation that this will in fact damage Russia's economic interests. And I think that one has to also look at exactly what kind of threats do these pose. I think it's arguable that obviously a Russian invasion of Ukraine is threatening not just to Ukraine, but to all of Europe and hence the United States. Whereas does Iran actually threaten the United States, or does it threaten certain American allies in the Middle East? I think we can agree that it's mainly considered a threat to those allies who happen to be working pretty closely with Russia. So why exactly are we spending so much effort defending allies who don't seem to want to cooperate with us against someone whom we consider a major adversary? I think that especially, it would be especially appropriate if the Saudis and the Emiratis don't want to increase their oil production, that's their prerogative. But if they understand that that means that there will be more Iranian oil exports, I think that they would, even if that's just a possibility, not an actuality, that maybe they would be a little more cooperative with regard to American interests. And so I think that part of the problem that we face now is an American inability to prioritize. In other words, we have lots of different adversaries: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the jihadists. Can we deal with them all simultaneously, equally? Or do we have to decide that we need to focus on those who are most serious to what we, not our allies, we consider our security interests? And I think that's something that we haven't done. And I think that the the question of Iran in particular, in other words, that there's a realpolitik argument that can be made for dropping sanctions on Iran, but that this is not the kind of argument that, in fact, is popular in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have Professor Kopalian who has a question, University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful. My question is directed at Bill Weaver. Professor Taylor, you noted the well-constrained Russia's finance sector and that they don't have a shortage of money to continue the conflict. At the same time, you noted the exponential decrease in Russia's production capacity. I was very curious, what is the effect of this on Russia's military-industrial complex and its ability to produce arms?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question, or Anna, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, if Anna could repeat the question.
Okay, the question was for Bill Taylor, is it?
Brian Taylor.
Brian Taylor, sorry. Brian Taylor?
Yes.
Okay. So the question was specific to discussion of Russia's finance sector. Professor Taylor noted that the finance sector has rebounded fairly well, that Russia does not have a shortage of money to continue the conflict. But he didn't know the exponential decrease in financial production capacity. My question is specific to Russia's military-industrial complex. With the exponential decrease in production capacity, will they be able to continue producing the armaments necessary to sustain the war effort?
I think I would defer to Brian's expertise of, Russian defense capacities and their posture around. I mean, I've seen reports of troops being moved in different places, and obviously we know of the, running out of all sorts of different sort of equipments and degradation. But what impact this has on, local theaters and conflicts, I think is worth thinking about. But I'd like to hear Brian's take on this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Anna. There's a lot of echo coming through when it comes through a mic and then to us. I don't know if you could quickly summarize the gist of the question, because I'm not sure I got it.
We have this air conditioning that is running, and it's so loud. I wonder if it's the Russian name. The question was that Brian, you mentioned as to how the Russian financial sector has rebounded, and that has allowed Russia to continue with the war effort, but you also mentioned the dramatic decline in its productive capacity. So Professor Kopalian wanted to know what's the impact of this both seemingly contradictory trends on Russia's military-industrial complex. Will Russia be able to continue in sustaining its military-industrial complex and continuing the war effort?
Okay. Got it. Thank you. Thanks very much for the question. So I think it's really an issue of time frame. I think over time, Russia's going to suffer in terms of the ability to get components that it needs from outside sources, including the West, for various military components. So although Russia has, probably the second largest arms industry in the world, it still depends a lot for specific components that are sourced internationally. And some of those components are now sanctioned, including not only from, countries in the EU and the United States, but also Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, right? There are multiple sources of inputs to Russian industry that are now being blocked. So combine that with the fact that they've taken very heavy losses in tanks, in armored personnel carriers. They've shot off a massive number of artillery shells, and I haven't seen yet a good accounting of what this is doing to their supply, but there was a story just recently about how, to replace the number of tanks that they've lost, it would take them 10 years. And that, I think, assumes that they're able to continue to produce at the rate that they were producing before the war, which I wouldn't think is guaranteed going forward. So I think what we're going to see is a return to some of these Cold War games where they try and get military technology from the West in illicit manners. And I suspect, and maybe Alex will have something to say about this, they'll try and use countries in the Eurasian Economic Union as sort of parallel imports and then re-imported to Russia. But I think that'll be less efficient than, old ways of sustaining these supply chains. So I guess my bottom line is that Russia has lost a lot of its military capacity in 4 months, more than I think they would have imagined and planned for. And that is not just only in terms of military equipment, but in terms of military personnel. So I know the question wasn't about this specifically, but we should mention that the estimates of the number of troops lost just in terms of deaths is 10, 15,000. Some people say more. We can assume that injured and otherwise unavailable troops would be 3 times that number. So we're talking, somewhere in the order of 40, 50, 60,000 personnel not available. So they're having to rely on various hidden forms of mobilization, putting pressure on draftees to sign contracts, trying to get people to sign up for the Wagner Group, the private military company, and that kind of thing, because the Kremlin seems very reluctant to issue an order for general mobilization because of the political costs. They're in a draft period now, and so far numbers are running below past draft periods, which suggests that young people and their parents don't necessarily want to send them to fight in this war, even though they might tacitly support it or even actively support it. It doesn't mean they want their kids going off to fight it. So I think the Russian, Putin's hope is that the West fractures and Ukraine breaks before the economic and social costs at home rise. And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think any of us know the answer to that question. But I think the cost to Russian economy and Russian society has been pretty severe so far.
If I could abuse my power as a moderator and follow up on what you just said, Brian, and also actually reflect on a sort of a theme that seems to cut across all 3 presentations. So it looks like, on the one hand, Russia is losing with all kinds of implications domestically and externally, but that also the West, the rules-based world order is also weakening, which is one of the goals, stated goals of the Kremlin. Alex mentioned that how different ministries within states are sort of kind of going one against the other, which to me adds up to a weakness, institutional weakness of states, which is very, very dangerous. Informal sources of power, and then if we geopolitically we're talking about U.S. focus. Mark mentioned the countries in the Middle East feel abandoned again. There is yet another region that is emerging as more important. So when you add up the pure geopolitics, the institutional effects, are we talking about weakening, sort of the exit, yet another exit from hegemony, and the institutional weakness is really worrisome to me, that is really emerging from this panel. Anyone who would like to take it?
Well, this is a really interesting, it's a really important question, because it's almost as if, not almost, like Ukraine and Russia are speaking 2 different languages about what this war is about, right? For Ukraine, it's obviously fighting for their very sovereignty, their right of existence, their nationhood, their identity, everything. And for Russia, it's almost like it's almost everything but Ukraine itself. It's about order, it's about NATO expansion, it's about US hegemony, it's about liberalism, it's about all these other kinds of things. And what you saw, and also with Putin's comments today, that this is the conflict that will accelerate the unraveling of the US-led liberal international order. Now, Putin might actually be right on a couple of dimensions. That doesn't mean that as a result of the war, Russia is going to have a dominant say in what that non-Western part of that world order is. And I think that's where I have like the real difference with the Russian assumption here about ordering dynamics. Sure, sanctions, the rise of the non-West, the global South, these different memes, you know, the kind of intertwining dynamics that Mark talked about, that's all happening. But who says that Russia's going to be at the center of that? They're not. They're becoming weaker, especially vis-a-vis China, especially vis-a-vis you know, some of their, you know, traditional sort of, you know, areas of sort of influence and strengths. They're going to become foreign policy takers as opposed to makers. And so, you know, maybe in, you know, 5-10 years time, in part due to this conflict, we see this acceleration of the end of sort of, you know, the liberal world order. But it doesn't mean that Moscow is somehow going to be in a condominium with China about that. I actually think a severely weakened, degraded Moscow might actually lament not being the first revisionist power, because at least then it had, you know, this kind of limelight on it. So, you know, to me, it's a very kind of confusing and presumptuous assumption that the Russian establishment has that, you know, smashing everything up is somehow going to put them in a better position.
Wow. And anyone else who, great, thank you so much, Alex. Anyone else who would like to comment on this? Is Putin winning while losing at the same time?
I agree with Alex. You know, I think I remember being at one of these Valdai conferences in 2018, not the big one with Putin, but a little one on the Middle East with Lavrov. And Sergei Karaganov, you know, was harping on about how American power is declining and there are other rising powers, you know, China, Russia, India. And I asked him, you know, let's assume that you're right, American power is declining. I think we can all agree that Chinese power is rising. Why do you assume that Russian power is rising? It seems that there's so many problems that Russia has that it might actually be declining. And Mr. Karaganov declined to address that question. I think, you know, that there is this, you know, wishful thinking in Moscow that somehow, you know, if in fact American power is declining, that somehow Russian power is rising. I think Alex is right. They're not going to be the leader of the non-West by any means. And there's a few Russians who have acknowledged this, that you know, that sort of the partnership with China can't last much more than 15 years on the current basis. That at a certain point, the Chinese are going to treat Russia like they treat everybody else, and you know, become more assertive. And so, you know, it's sort of, does Russia really have the choice about being either the junior partner of the West or the junior partner to China? And which does it want? That there don't seem to be any other real possibilities.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just going to run to the other computer to see if there's, I think there's a question in the chat to which I want to get. Just one sec. We have a very complicated setup here to run this in a hybrid form, but I'm not seeing it on this computer. Just one sec. I have to. We need to see what's the questions on the chat. Okay, I was mistaken, so there are no questions on the chat. Okay, very good. Any other questions from the, I think I could go for another hour, but I promise to follow up with all of you separately, and I hope to catch you all at one of the conferences in the US or Europe or in Armenia perhaps one day. Definitely you put so much on the table. I feel so enriched, and I'm speaking on behalf of the audience here. Thank you very, very much for participating, and I look forward to reconnecting with you on other events. Thank you very much to all three of you, Alex Cooley, Brian Taylor, and Mark Katz. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Brian.